Camping trips are supposed to be relaxing, but this one turned out to be anything but that. It was just me, my tent, and the quiet woods around me. The air was still, and the only sounds I could hear were the leaves rustling and an owl hooting every now and then. I had picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any trails or other campers, to really escape from everything. It seemed like exactly what I needed, or so I thought. The first night was quiet. I cooked my dinner over the fire, enjoyed the peace, and fell asleep without any trouble. But on the second night, things changed. I woke up in the middle of the night, feeling weird. The air felt heavier, and the woods seemed too quiet. My fire had died down to just a few glowing pieces of wood, barely giving off any light. I felt a tightness in the air, like something was watching me, but I tried to brush it off as just being nervous. I tried to go back to sleep, but I kept hearing noises, twigs snapping, leaves crunching. I told myself it was just animals, nothing to worry about. But then, I noticed something. Every time I moved in my sleeping bag, the noises outside would stop. And when I stayed still, they would start again. It was like something was copying my movements, staying just out of sight. I sat up, trying to listen more carefully, and the noises stopped completely. The silence was overwhelming. I could feel my heart beating hard in my chest. I thought about grabbing my flashlight to check outside, but something in me hesitated. It felt wrong, like I shouldn't let whatever was out there know I was awake. Minutes passed, maybe hours, I couldn't tell. But eventually, the noises started again. This time, they were closer. I could hear something brushing against my tent, a soft, almost careful sound. My breath caught in my throat as I waited, my mind spinning with thoughts of what could be out there. Then, I noticed a faint sound, like something being dragged across the ground. It was slow, steady, like someone or something was circling my tent, dragging something heavy behind it. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and switched it on, shining it through the thin walls of the tent. But the moment the light hit the walls, the sound stopped again. I waited, holding my breath, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound. Just the weak glow of my flashlight casting shadows on the tent walls. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed up, sitting in the middle of my tent, holding my flashlight and listening for any sign of whatever was out there. But the noises never came back. When the first light of dawn started to come through the trees, I packed up my things as fast as I could. I didn't bother with breakfast or packing up neatly. I just wanted to get out of there. As I was hiking back to my car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the path leading away from my campsite, there were deep grooves in the dirt, like something heavy had been dragged through the night. The marks led off into the woods, disappearing among the trees. I didn't stop to look closer. I didn't want to know what had made those marks. All I knew was that I wasn't alone out there, and whatever it was, it had been much closer than I ever wanted to admit. As I drove away, the woods behind me felt darker, more threatening, like they were hiding secrets I was never supposed to find. Weeks later, I couldn't stop thinking about those marks. They haunted me, making it hard to sleep at night. One evening, I was watching the news, and they reported that a body had been found not far from where I camped. The body was dragged, the reporter said, like something had pulled it through the woods. No one knew what had done it. I never went camping again. And I never felt safe, knowing whatever was out there was still waiting, maybe watching, ready to find someone else who wandered too deep into the woods. I had been excited about this camping trip for weeks. The plan was simple: spend a weekend alone in the woods to clear my head. I packed light, bringing just the basics: tent, sleeping bag, some food, and my pocket knife. I picked a spot deep in the forest, far away from the usual trails. I wanted to get away from the noise and rush of the city. The first night was quiet. It was so still that it felt strange at first, but I got used to it. The fire crackled softly, and the stars above were brighter than I had seen in a long time. After a simple meal, I crawled into my tent and quickly fell asleep. The next day, I decided to explore the area a bit. The trees were tall, their branches making a roof that blocked out most of the sunlight. It was cooler here, and the air felt fresh. As I walked, I noticed something odd, a set of tracks leading off the path. They didn't look like animal tracks. They were too big and too deep. I paused for a moment, but my curiosity won out. I followed the tracks, carefully stepping over fallen branches and trying not to make too much noise. The tracks led to a small clearing, and that's when I saw it, a campsite, but not like mine. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. The tent was torn, the fire pit was a mess of ash, and there were things scattered around as if someone had just up and left. A chill ran down my spine. There was no sign of the person who had been there, no note, nothing to explain what had happened. I quickly turned back, retracing my steps to my own camp. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me jump. By the time I got back, the sun was starting to set. I tried to push the strange campsite out of my mind, telling myself it was just someone who left in a rush. Maybe they got scared by an animal, I thought. But I couldn't relax that night. I kept hearing noises, soft, almost quiet sounds, like someone was creeping around outside my tent. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear something, a twig snapping, leaves moving. I finally drifted off sometime after midnight, but I woke up to a loud noise. It was the clear sound of footsteps, close and heavy. My heart pounded in my chest as I reached for my pocket knife, holding it tight under my sleeping bag. The footsteps stopped, right outside my tent. I could see the shadow of someone, standing just beyond the fabric. They didn't move for what felt like forever. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. Then, as quickly as they had come, the footsteps moved away, fading into the distance. I didn't dare move until the first light of morning broke through the trees. When I finally unzipped my tent, there was nothing, no sign that anyone had been there. The ground was untouched, no footprints, no broken branches. But I knew what I had heard, and the memory of those footsteps stuck in my mind. I packed up as quickly as I could, not caring that I was leaving half my stuff behind. I just wanted to get out of there. As I walked back to my car, every sound made me jump. When I finally reached the road, I let out a sigh of relief. But as I drove away, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror, far back in the trees. Just for a second, I thought I saw movement. Something tall, dark, and watching. I didn't stay to find out what it was. I've tried to forget about that weekend, but it's been impossible. I haven't gone camping since. Every time I think about going back into the woods, I remember that shadow outside my tent, standing there, silent and waiting. And I know, deep down, that if I ever go back, it might not just be watching next time. It might be waiting for me to return. It was a chilly autumn evening when my neighbor, Joe, asked if I wanted to join him for a weekend camping trip. I'd always liked Joe's adventurous side, so I said yes, looking forward to a break from the usual routine. We reached the campsite late in the afternoon, deep in the woods. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the forest floor. Joe set up his tent while I gathered firewood. As we sat by the fire, the only sound was the crackling of the logs, cutting through the otherwise still night. Around midnight, I heard rustling in the bushes. At first, I thought it was just animals, but the noises got louder, almost like someone, or something, was deliberately trying to make a sound. I glanced at Joe, who seemed to be asleep, and decided to check it out. I took a flashlight and walked towards the noise. The light cut through the darkness, revealing only trees and shadows. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw something odd, fresh footprints in the dirt, leading away from our campsite. My heart started pounding. The footprints were too big to be from any animal I knew. I followed them a little way but stopped when I realized they went deeper into the woods. I rushed back to camp, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be out there. Joe was awake when I got back, I told him about the footprints, and he looked worried. We decided to stay alert, taking turns keeping watch. The night passed in tense silence, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig and the distant hoot of an owl. As dawn neared, the noises stopped, and the forest seemed eerily quiet. We packed up and left the campsite, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. On our way out, we found more tracks. These looked different, as if someone had been watching us from the trees. The sight made my skin crawl. Back at home, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd been followed. The whole experience was unsettling, and I kept wondering if someone had been hiding in the woods, watching our every move. The mystery of the footprints was never solved, but one thing was clear: the woods were not as empty as they seemed. As I lay in bed, I couldn't escape the chilling thought that whatever had been out there was still watching, waiting for the right moment to come back. The haunting sense of being watched lingered, a cold reminder that some things in the dark should remain unexplored. Last summer, my brother-in-law Greg and I decided to go camping in the middle of nowhere. We chose a spot deep in the woods, far away from any regular campsites. It was a great spot, thick trees, a clear stream, and perfect for a quiet escape. We got there early in the afternoon, set up our tent, and made a fire. As the sun set, we sat by the fire, enjoying the peace. The night fell quickly, and the forest seemed to close in around us. The only sounds were the crickets and an occasional owl hooting. Around midnight, I woke up to a rustling noise outside the tent. I thought it was probably a deer or some other animal. I tried to go back to sleep, but the noise kept going. It was too loud for an animal. It sounded like something, or someone, was moving around our campsite. I quietly got up, grabbed a flashlight, and unzipped the tent. I shone the light around but didn't see anything. The rustling stopped as soon as I stepped outside. I checked the area around our campsite, found nothing out of place, and went back to bed. The next morning, we went for a hike. I noticed that the path seemed unfamiliar, even though we hadn't wandered far from our campsite. Greg brushed it off, saying the forest all looked the same. I felt uneasy, but kept it to myself. When we got back to the campsite, things were strange. I saw that the food we'd left in the cooler was scattered around. The cooler was open, but nothing inside was missing. Greg thought maybe a raccoon had gotten in, so we cleaned up and packed the food away securely. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The rustling started again, and this time it was louder. I decided to stay awake and keep watch. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps coming toward the tent. They were slow and deliberate, like someone was carefully walking toward us. My heart pounded as I listened, barely breathing. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it through the tent's window. I saw a shadowy figure standing right outside. It was tall and seemed to be staring directly at us. I held my breath, frozen. The figure finally turned and walked away into the darkness. At first light, Greg and I packed up quickly. As we left, I saw broken branches and disturbed bushes leading away from our campsite. It was clear that someone had been watching us and moving around the area while we slept. When we got back to the trailhead, we told the park ranger about what happened. They promised to look into it, but I knew we were lucky to have escaped. Whatever, or whoever, was out there was dangerous. The feeling of being watched wouldn't leave me, and the thought of that shadowy figure haunted me long after. We never went back to that spot. The woods had gone from a peaceful retreat to a place of hidden danger. The memory of that figure still sends shivers down my spine. Sometimes, when the night is quiet and I'm alone, I can still hear the rustling. It's as if the woods are waiting for us to come back, ready to trap us in their silent embrace. My friend and I decided to take a weekend trip to a cabin far out in the woods. We both needed a break from our busy lives, and this place seemed perfect. No phone signal, no internet, just nature and some peace and quiet. The cabin was small but comfortable, with an old wood stove, a couple of worn-out chairs, and a tiny kitchen that looked like it hadn't changed in years. The first day was calm. We walked the trails near the cabin, enjoyed the fresh air, and took in the silence. By the time the sun started going down, we were tired, ready to relax by the fire and call it a night. The second day was much like the first. We explored a bit farther from the cabin, but by late afternoon, dark clouds rolled in, and it got cold quickly. We decided to head back before the storm hit. We made it inside just as the first drops of rain began to fall. The rain came down hard, pounding on the roof and windows, while the wind roared through the trees. The storm was rough, the kind that makes you glad to be inside. We got a fire going and tried to relax, but something about the storm made me uneasy. The wind seemed to carry strange noises, almost like distant voices, but I kept telling myself it was just the storm playing tricks on me. As the night dragged on, the storm only got worse. The rain kept coming, and the wind sounded like it was trying to tear the cabin apart. Around midnight, we heard a loud crash outside. It sounded like a tree had fallen near the cabin. My friend and I exchanged worried looks, but neither of us wanted to go out in that weather to check. A few minutes later, we heard it again, another loud crash, this time even closer. My heart started to race. It didn't sound like a tree anymore. It sounded like something, or someone, was out there, trying to get in. We both sat up, staring at the door. The only light in the cabin was from the fire, and the shadows it cast danced in strange ways on the walls. Then, without warning, the door handle started to shake. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a small movement. It was strong, like someone was really trying to open the door. The door creaked as if it wouldn't hold much longer against the force. My friend and I froze, too scared to move. Suddenly, the shaking stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of the storm outside. For a moment, I thought it was over, but then the door flew open, and the wind blew out the fire. The cabin was thrown into darkness, and all I could hear was the storm and my own breathing. In the complete darkness, I felt my friend grab my arm. We had no idea what to do. We couldn't see anything, and the fear of whatever, or whoever, was out there was overwhelming. The door slammed shut again, and we could hear footsteps, slow, heavy, on the wooden floor. They got closer and closer until they were right in front of us. Then, the footsteps stopped. I could feel that someone was standing there, but I couldn't see anything. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what was happening, but nothing made sense. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, too scared to move or make a sound. Finally, the footsteps started again, this time moving away from us, toward the door. It creaked open once more, and then it slammed shut, like whatever had come in had just left. We waited in silence for what felt like forever before we finally dared to move. When we lit a match to relight the fire, the cabin was empty. The door was still closed, but the floor was wet from the rain. The rest of the night is a blur. We didn't sleep. We just sat there, waiting for morning, waiting for the storm to end. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the windows, we grabbed our stuff and left, not caring about the storm or the mud. We didn't talk about it. We just wanted to get out of there. Even now, I can't explain what happened that night. I don't know if it was a person or something else. But I do know one thing, I'll never go back to that cabin again. Sometimes there are things out there that we're not supposed to understand. And whatever was in that cabin with us that night, it wasn't done with us. It was just waiting, biding its time. The thought still keeps me up at night, wondering if it will ever come looking for us again. My sister and I had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. We chose a spot deep in the woods, away from the nearest campground. It was a remote place, perfect for a quiet escape. By the time we arrived, the sun was setting, so we quickly set up our tent and got a fire going. As night settled in, the forest became silent except for the crackling fire. We roasted marshmallows and reminisced about our childhood. The sky was clear, and the stars shone brightly. After a while, we decided to go to bed. I went to sleep first while my sister stayed up reading a book by flashlight. I woke up around midnight needing to use the bathroom. Our campsite was about 50 yards from a small stream, so I walked over there with a flashlight. As I got close to the stream, I saw something odd, a set of fresh footprints leading away from the water and toward our tent. The footprints were large, almost like a man's, and they looked recent. My heart began to race. I rushed back to the tent, trying to shake off the growing fear. When I got there, my sister was asleep, so I tried to calm down and went back to bed. The night seemed endless. Every little sound was amplified: the rustling leaves, snapping twigs, and distant owl hoots. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. Around 3 a.m., I heard a noise outside the tent. It was the sound of something, or someone, walking around the campsite. I froze, listening closely. The footsteps were heavy and methodical, moving around the edge of our tent. I woke my sister quietly. We decided to stay silent, hoping whoever it was would leave. The footsteps continued for what felt like hours, then suddenly stopped. We lay still in the dark, holding our breath. After an uneasy silence, we heard rustling near the edge of our campsite. I slowly unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek outside. There was no one there, but the area around our fire pit was messed up, and the fresh footprints were still visible, leading off into the darkness. We knew we had to leave. We quickly packed up our things, trying not to make a sound. The whole time, it felt like we were being watched, like someone was lurking just beyond the trees. When we finally reached our car and drove away, I glanced back at the campsite. The trees looked dark and menacing, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. We never talked about it again, but neither of us ever returned to that spot. The reality of what happened that night sank in. We weren't alone. Whatever, or whoever, had been out there had been watching us, waiting. And the thought of that presence still being out there, watching from the shadows, fills me with a deep, cold fear that never really goes away. The woods were silent, but I know now that silence can be far more terrifying than noise. My wife and I had been talking about this camping trip for a while. We both needed a quiet weekend away. No phones, no internet, just the two of us and the woods. We found a spot deep in the forest, far from the main paths but not so far that we couldn't find our way back if we needed to. The first day was easy. We set up the tent, gathered some firewood, and spent the night by the fire, watching the flames flicker under the stars. It was exactly what we wanted, a peaceful break from everything. The next day, we decided to walk around and see more of the area. The forest was thick, with trees so close together that you could easily lose your way if you weren't careful. We walked for hours, taking in the quiet, untouched beauty around us. Everything felt so calm, almost too calm, like the forest itself was waiting for something. After a while, we found a small open space. It seemed like a good place to rest. As we sat down, I noticed something strange. The ground wasn't even, and when I looked closer, I saw what looked like the remains of an old cabin. There wasn't much left, just a few rotting wood pieces and some stones scattered around, but it was enough to make me feel uneasy. I tried to ignore the feeling, but it stayed with me as we kept walking. It was getting late, so we decided to head back to our camp. But on the way back, we realized we were lost. The forest, which had seemed so friendly earlier, now felt like a maze. Every tree looked the same, and the path we thought we knew had disappeared. Panic started to set in. I knew we couldn't be too far from our camp, but the longer we walked, the more lost we became. The sun was getting lower, and the shadows were growing longer, making everything look even more unfamiliar. After what felt like forever, we finally found our way back. I felt a huge sense of relief when I saw our tent. But something wasn't right. The campsite looked different. The fire we had made earlier was out, but that wasn't what bothered me. Our tent, which we had left zipped up, was now open, the flap moving slightly in the evening breeze. My heart started racing as I got closer. Everything was where we had left it, except for one thing. Right in the middle of our sleeping bags was a small, old, rusted key. I had no idea where it came from. We hadn't brought anything like that with us, and it definitely wasn't there when we left. I stared at the key, trying to make sense of it. My mind went back to that old cabin foundation. Could it have come from there? But how? We were supposed to be the only ones out here, or at least that's what I thought. The forest, which had once felt like a safe retreat, now felt like a trap. Every sound, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig, sent chills down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone anymore, that someone, or something, was out there, watching us. We didn't stay another night. We packed up as quickly as we could, leaving the key where we found it. The drive home was silent, both of us too scared to talk. The whole time, I couldn't stop thinking about that key and what it meant. Was it a warning? A sign? Or just some strange coincidence? We never figured it out, and to this day, I can't bring myself to go camping again. The woods, once a place of peace, now hold a dark, unsettling memory that I can't shake. That trip was supposed to be a break from the world, but instead, it left me with a question that haunts me every time I close my eyes. What, or who, was out there with us that day? And what would have happened if we had stayed another night?